cold brew coffee and iced coffee are both, well, cold coffee drinks, but they're very different in brew method, in chemical composition, and most importantly, in taste. Iced coffee uses hot water that's flash chilled when it hits the ice, whereas cold brew uses room temperature water, resulting in a very different extraction process. So let's take a look at how to brew these. We'll look at the differences in tasting notes and some of the scientific differences as well. And let's get started with iced coffee. Now, iced coffee is essentially hot coffee made over ice. So it's rapidly chilled when that coffee hits the ice. You can make this as a drip coffee or as a pour over. I'm using a Chemex to make my iced coffee. Now we need hot water for this. So for my Chemex, I use hot water at 93. Now we're going to split the brewing water between ice and hot water, but we'll get to that in a moment. First of all, though, we need to figure out how much coffee we need. Well, for my pour over method, I use a 16:1 ratio, which is 16 parts water to 1 part coffee, and I use a medium coarse grind. So I'm going to use 34 grams of coffee, and then I'm going to split my brewing water between ice and hot water. So that split, I'm using 200 grams of ice, which I add into the Chemex before brewing, and then I will use 320 grams of the hot water. So I use my usual pour over method to add that hot water through the coffee grinds where it comes in contact with the ice and flash chills. That's it. It's a very easy drink to make. Now that's very different to cold brew. Cold brew is an immersion method. So the coffee grinds stay in contact with room temperature or even chilled water. There's no hot water involved. Now I use coarsely ground coffee grinds for this one at a ratio of either 4:1 to 8:1, depending on how strong I want the cold brew to be. 4:1 would be cold brew concentrate and it would need to be watered down later. 8:1, not so much. There's lots of different ways to make cold brew coffee. One of my favorites is just to use a mason jar with these little French press brew bags and add the coffee grinds into there. Or alternatively, you can use a dedicated device that perhaps includes a metal sleeve to keep the coffee grinds separate from the water. Either way, those coffee grinds are going to sit in that water for many hours, typically between 12 to 18 hours, either at room temperature or in the fridge. I prefer to keep mine in the fridge. Now, those are two very different brewing methods, and those result in some very big sensory differences as well. Cold brew is often described as having a smoother, sweeter taste with lower acidity. The reduced acidity gives a much mellower mouthfeel. Now, iced coffee, on the other hand, that retains more bright, more acidic, and sometimes more of a bitter profile, which is much more similar to, well, hot coffee, which of course it is. That's what it is. It's hot coffee quickly chilled. The flavor is often more complex and a bit more robust, and sometimes that mouthfeel can be a little bit harder. So what are the scientific differences? Well, if we think of the primary differences here, one uses hot water that's then quickly chilled, and the other one uses room temperature water. And the second difference is that with iced coffee, the water passes through the coffee pretty quickly, whereas with cold brew, that coffee is staying in contact, immersed in the water for hours and hours at a time. That is going to result in some scientific differences. Well, if you think about the hot water side of things, hot water promotes the dissolution of all sorts of molecules, including many acids and aromatic oils, and that contributes to aroma and bitterness. So that's why iced coffee tends to be a bit more bitter. Whereas cold brew has fewer volatile aromatics extracted because it wasn't using hot water, and has a smoother mouthfeel because of it. Now, I wanted to see the actual differences between my iced coffee and my cold brew, and the first test I used was a TDS meter. Now, TDS, that stands for total dissolved solids. This tells us how many dissolved solids in terms of parts per million are in the drink. Now, it doesn't tell us what those solids are, only their presence. And it turns out that both the iced coffee and the cold brew have pretty similar TDS meter readings. But what about pH? Well, cold brew typically has a higher pH, which means it's less acidic. Because acidic compounds are extracted more efficiently at higher temperatures, you will see more acid in the iced coffee, which used hot water. Or at least in theory. What did we see in practice? Well, my trusty pH meter told me that my iced coffee had a pH of 5.1 and my cold brew had a pH of 6.7. So there was a noticeable difference here. The lower value means it was more acidic. The iced coffee was more acidic, just as we expected. Now, there is one other difference here, and that relates to shelf life. Now, cold brew coffee can be kept in the fridge as long as it's sealed and closed up for a good amount of time. Typically 7 to 10 days, it'll still stay pretty fresh. Iced coffee, on the other hand, not so much, maybe a day or two, but it's much better if it's consumed pretty much right away. What's the reason for that? Well, the low temperature extraction process for cold brew coffee limits oxidation. Because hot water extracts a broad range of compounds, and that includes more organic acids, the cooled coffee, the iced coffee, that tends to oxidize more rapidly. So drink your iced coffee pretty much as soon as you brew it, but the cold brew can sit in the fridge. So those are two different forms of cold coffee, and I think they do have a very different taste profile. Let me know in the comments which your preference is. I have to say, for me, I'm team cold brew. Thanks for watching.